Annual Books and More sale will be held Friday and Saturday, April 14th and 15th, in the Center for Western Studies Fantle Building. Gifts for the sale will be accepted through March. We are grateful to Augustana's Mellon Fund for support for this evening presentation. I am delighted to introduce tonight's special guest, best-selling author Greg Johnson, recipient of awards in this country and abroad. Craig has, over the course of 17 novels, used the character of Walt Longmire, sheriff of Absaroka County, Wyoming, to champion justice, care for the less fortunate, and steward the land. Basing the Netflix Longmire series on the books provided a depth of character development and richness of content. There will be a question and answer period at the end of the presentation, and Craig will be available to sign copies of his books in the concourse. And now, please join me in welcoming Craig Johnson.
Thank you, dear. You were lovely. All right, now the big question. Okay, do you want the 6-foot Craig Johnson or do you want the 6'4" Craig Johnson? Which one do you want? Okay, which one do you prefer? You want me up here? You want me up here? I feel closer to God. This is wonderful. There must be nothing to do in Sioux Falls tonight. Okay, you guys are all here. Like, for goodness sake, this is marvelous. Thank you for having me. Judy and I had a big argument about it. Like, she kept saying, you haven't ever been to Sioux Falls. And I was like, yeah, I have. She's like, I-29 does not count. You can't say that. Like, and so this is like one of the holes that I've been able to fill. Like, and it's really a marvelous place to be. It's magnificent. We went for a little walk after having dinner last night, looking at the architecture. It was just marvelous. And we only take our dog to nice places. So I will have you know that since we have Annie with us, this gets the word as being one of the nicer places. I don't know if you know it or not. I can say honestly that I'm probably the biggest author in Ucross. I think, Ucross, Wyoming, population 25 or 26. We've been having a lot of controversy lately here at Ucross. And one of the reasons being that that our population supposedly bumped up one, which we can't figure out who it is. We've been giving a lot of thought to that, all 25 of us. And there weren't any new babies born. There wasn't anybody that moved in or anything like that. And so what we're thinking is this is something that, that the Wyoming state government has tried to figure out to get more money out of the federal government, I think is what it is. If they have a certain percentage of towns that have an uptick, in population base. And so after 40 years, they decided, you know what, Ucross is going up one. So then the problem is we have 3 signs going into Ucross, from 3 different directions, right? Because we have 1 stop sign in the whole town. And 2 of the signs say 26, but one of them still says 25. So we're thinking more like 25 and 2/3, which brings up even more of a question. Who's that 2/3 of a person that's living in our town? But this is an opportunity for me, because this is home territory. We drove over, and that's one of the great joys. I love driving across South Dakota. It's gorgeous country. It's a beautiful time of year. To be driving across to see the silage out of all the cornfields, and it's just a beautiful time with the fall colors and everything, and the leaves and everything, and it was snowing back home, so I was kind of glad to get here, I have to admit, because it's going to be enough of that soon enough, but I'm always trying to think whenever I'm doing one of these type of events, I'm always trying to think, what's a story that I can tell that will be indicative of what my life is like now. And I came up with one. It was actually a story from a couple of years back, whenever we were flying out of Billings, Montana. And it's interesting because my wife, she won't fly out of the planes that fly out of northern Wyoming, because they're the kind where they give you a leather helmet and a pair of goggles, and tell you when it starts moving, jump in, and we'll go and so inevitably what we end up doing is going up to Billings, going up to Billings, Montana, and grabbing a plane out of there. And so we were over in Cody, and we're on our way up to Billings to get a plane. And my wife knows that traveling with me is kind of like traveling with a trained bear. as long as it stays fed, everything will probably be okay. But if it gets hungry, things could kind of go sideways. And so she always makes sure I get something to eat. And so we stop in a little cafe on the outskirts of Red Lodge, Montana, and I, go in, we have something to eat, and I go over to write a check for lunch, which kind of gives you an indication of what kind of a place it is, because you could still write a check for lunch. And so I go over to write this check, and when I'm not wearing one of these, I'm wearing one of those Absaroka County Sheriff's Department ball caps that we have out there on the Walmart, out there on the tables like that. And if you didn't, they're brown and they got the emblem, for the, Absaroka County Sheriff's Department, on the back it says Durant, Wyoming, like that. Well, if you didn't know there was no 24th county in Wyoming, if you didn't know there was no such thing as Absaroka County, they look pretty real, right? And so the one that I'm wearing is kind of weathered down. It was one of the prototypes. And it's kind of weathered down with sweat stains, and all this. And so I'm writing the check, and the woman behind the counter, she goes, "Where'd you get that hat?" And she said it real aggressive like, and I thought, oh no, she thinks I'm a sheriff's deputy and somebody's dined and ditched, and I'm gonna have to go chase somebody down the streets of Red Lodge like that. And so I pointed at my head and I said, "It's not a real county." And she goes, "The hell it's not, it's Walt Longmire's county." So I felt like I'd been smacked, so I looked at her and I go, "Well, I'm Craig Johnson." And she goes, "So?" And I said, "Well, I'm the guy that writes the books." And she goes, "What books?" And that's when that little voice in the back of my head said, "You should just get out of here, take whatever shreds of dignity you've got left and leave." But my pride wouldn't let me do it. And so I stood there, I stood my ground, and I said, "Well, the books that the TV show is based off of," and I'll never forget her response. She said, "There are books?" And so what I did at that point in time, I called up, Viking Penguin the next day, and I said, "I have a new motto for us. Yes, there are books." So, but it wasn't always that way. Whenever I started out writing the books, and it was a little bit of a, you got to remember, this was 20 years ago. At that point in time, everything in, crime fiction was noir. It was all gritty. It was all urban. It was all like alcoholic detectives who were divorced and burying bodies in their backyards and getting away with it and stuff like that. And I thought to myself, that's just not the people that I know that work in law enforcement. They work really hard and they're good people and they do a lot of wonderful things and make wonderful sacrifices, for the society and the culture as a whole that. And I thought, well, what if you had the sheriff of the least populated county in the least populated state in America? That would work. The whole idea being at this vertical individual in a horizontal landscape. I thought, that would, standing against something, wouldn't that work? And I guess what I didn't take into consideration is how many people can you kill in the least populated county in Wyoming? Before it starts getting kind of absurd and so what I did with that, of course, was I'll jump ahead a little bit. I started going back and forth where I play Walt almost like a ball team. I have him play at home and away and so that way he's outside of Absaroka County and when some of these murders happen too so it's not quite so bad. But anyway, I sat down and I wrote the first 2 chapters of The Cold Dish, the very first book in the Walt Longmire series, and I wrote the first 2 chapters and they were horrible. They were really, really bad. Trust me, I know. I wrote them. I know how bad they were. And so I thought, why are they as bad as they are? And I thought, you don't know enough about rural sheriffing. You need to go talk to a rural sheriff, and see how it is that they do what they do and all of that. And so I drove the 18 miles into Buffalo, Wyoming, the county seat of Johnson County, and I get there and you got to remember this is before 9/11. So there's no, computer rooms or bulletproof glass or anything like that. There was a wooden counter is what there was. And then down the hallway, there was a door propped up and I could see a guy's boots up on his desk at the end of the hallway there. And so I said, I knocked on the counter and this voice goes, "What?" And I said, "Hey, Sheriff, could I talk to you for a minute?" And this fellow came out, this fellow by the name of Larry Kirkpatrick. He'd been the sheriff there in Johnson County so long he had pigeon shit on his shoulders from being a statue. And so, I said, "Can I talk to you for a minute, Sheriff?" And then he said, "Well, yeah, sure." And so I told him, I said, "My name's Craig Johnson. I've got a little ranch out near Ucross, and I've got a murder mystery that I'm writing about a Wyoming sheriff. And I was just wondering if you would be willing to kind of go through it with me and, and help me out with it." And so he said, well, come on back into my office. Like, and so I walked back into his office. Like, and I got to tell you that in the last 18 years, I've spoken to the National Sheriff's Association. I've spoken to the Western Sheriff's Association, all these different sheriff's associations. I've been in a lot of sheriff's offices in the last 17 years, purely on a professional basis. Like I can assure you. But not all of them have bookshelves in their offices. Okay. And so when I walked into Larry's office, he had bookshelves in there. I was like, this is good. This is probably good. So I'm sitting there talking with him, and I said, well, what do you think? And he goes, well, I don't know how much help I'm going to be, with this. I've never done anything like this, and I don't know how much help I'm going to be. And I said, well, I'm not looking for literary, construction here. I'm looking for how it is you'd process a homicide investigation, with limited resources and, limited funds and, limited, staff and all of this. And he said, well, what the heck? He says, I've never done anything like it before, but what the heck? I'll give it a try. I'll try and help you out with it. I was so happy when I walked out of that office. I was so assured, that I had solved my problem that I went home and added on to my house. And then I built a shop and a barn and loading chutes and corrals and everything like that. And finally, there was one day I came back into the office, and I was looking for something. And I was looking through the drawers in the back room there in the office, and pulled out the third drawer down on the right-hand side. And those two lonely little chapters of The Cold Dish were looking up at me, and 10 years had gone by. Yeah. So I don't want to hear any of that crap about writer's block or anything like that, But I thought, you got the place all up and going, and everything like that. You really don't have any excuses. You're training to, and you wanted to write a novel and you started it. You should sit down and you should get started on it again. And I thought, this is going to be embarrassing like that because you're going to have to go in and you're going to have to reintroduce yourself to that sheriff all over again. I knew he was still the sheriff because I'd voted for him 3 times. And so I knew he was still in office. But I couldn't work up the nerve. I was too embarrassed. And I thought, this is too embarrassing. I don't think I'm going to be able to do it. And so I was in town and I was, putting gas, in the ranch truck, and I'm standing there on the pump island, pumping gas, and all of a sudden this police cruiser, sheriff's cruiser, pulls in on the other side of the pump island, stops. This guy gets out, puts the nozzle in, starts filling up his cruiser, and he turns around, and he looks at me, and he pops his hat back, and he drops his Ray-Bans down on his nose and folds his arms, and he's giving me this look, and the look says, "What did I arrest you for, and when was it?" And so I look at him and I say, "Hey, Sheriff Kirkpatrick," and I stick out my hand. I said, "You're not going to remember me." But he goes, "Your name's Craig Johnson. You're the one that's got that little ranch out near Ucross, and you're the one writing a murder mystery about a Wyoming sheriff." This was a 5-minute conversation from 10 years previous. And I looked at him and I said, "That is absolutely amazing." And he goes, Yeah. If you don't mind me saying so, this book is going kind of slow." Well, that pissed me off. Okay. But it was true. It was true. But then I sat down and I really started getting into it. I thought, okay, if I'm going to write this book, I'm going to write this book. And so I sat down and got started again on The Cold Dish. And so I worked on that first chapter for a couple of weeks, finally got it up, and done to where I thought it was readable, And at that time, he had given me his card. And so I had the internet. I had this thing called the internet, and so I had his email. And so I thought, I'm going to send it in to him via email and just let him read it. And then if he gets in touch with me, then we'll see where we go to from there. It was 11:20 at night. And so I just fired it off and said, "Hey, Larry, here's the first chapter of The Cold Dish, that book I was telling you about. See what you think." And so, went to bed, got up the next morning. It's a ranch. I'm up around 5:30 or so, get up. It's my favorite time of the day because, I make a pot of coffee and I walk out there on the front porch. It's all quiet and the sun's just starting to come up and the birds are singing. It's just a beautiful time of day. And then I hear something out there on the porch. I hear something a noise. And it's not a noise that you usually hear in the UCLA area. That would be Ucross, Claremont, Leiter, and Arvada. And it's just not a noise you hear, and it's a siren is what it is. And I walk to the edge of the porch, with my coffee cup, and I see this squad car sliding in a 4-wheeled lock, sliding to a stop, spinning around, comes blowing up the driveway at about 90 miles an hour, spraying gravel and dust the whole way. Slides to a stop right there in front of the house. The door flings open. Sheriff Larry steps out and says, "I know who did it." And all I could think was, I must really suck at this, you know? I said, Larry, it's a 16-chapter book with an epilogue. Are you sure you want to guess who did it in the first chapter? And he goes, I'm a trained professional. I know who did it. And I was like, okay. And he guessed, and he was wrong. And I took a great deal of satisfaction in telling him that. And he just looks at me for a moment, and he goes, well, damn. And then he just gets back in his car, and closes the door and goes back down the ranch road again and disappears. And I thought, well, I've lost that source, haven't I, right? So I'm thinking, well, what am I going to do? Because I don't, he's the only sheriff in our county. What am I going to do? Okay. So I'm trying to think about what I'm going to do. And I'm writing, working on the second chapter, working on it another week or so. I think it's pretty much, where I want it to be. And I thought, what, I'm just going to send it in to him and see what he says. But I'm not going to make the same mistake. I thought I'm going to send it in. It's 2:00 in the afternoon. And I'm going to send it in, and then he can have a chance to respond if he wants to quickly or not. I sent the thing in. The phone rings 20 minutes later. It's Sheriff Larry, and he goes, I know who did it now. And I said, Larry, you can't guess after every chapter. And he goes, the hell I can. It's my county. I can guess as many times as I want. And I was like, all right, who do you think it is? He guessed again. He was wrong again. And he goes, you're just changing it every time I guess. I was like, no, Larry, I got a 10-year-old outline I'm working from. He guessed after every single chapter, and he never got it right. And I told him, by the time we got to the end, I said, you know what? I'm starting to feel pretty good about my abilities as a crime fiction writer, but I'm starting to have some serious doubts about the Johnson County Sheriff's Department here at this point in time. But Larry was great, because he, really provided a lot of the detail that I desperately needed, for the book. And there was actually a story that I told, there on the public television here this afternoon. It was a really wonderful, wonderful interview and wonderful show if you get a chance to watch it. It's marvelous. Lori's just a fantastic interviewer. And we had a great time. But what happened was there are things you learn, that you don't know, if you're not a sheriff in a place. And so he said in that first chapter, you got a couple of mistakes. And I said, well, what are they? And he says, well, the first one is you've got people out on the Powder River in a bar drinking beer out of bottles. It's can-only bars on the Powder River, Country Craig. And I was like, why is that? And he said, because people, if you give them bottles, they break them and throw them at each other, and you can get hurt. And so I paused for a second. And I said, well, Larry, if you throw a full can of beer, you can hurt somebody. And there was an even longer pause. And he goes, Craig, nobody on the Powder River ever threw a full can of beer. Okay, and so it was a learning process for me as we went along. But yeah, that was that was when things really started kind of happening like that. And I actually had the first library get in touch with me about doing an event, and I'd never been asked to do anything in a library other than like that. And so I thought, this is wonderful, an opportunity to do this. And it was in Meeteetse, which is over in the western part of the state, which has a population of 327. So that's a big town in Wyoming. And so I was kind of excited about the opportunity to do it. And she wrote and she said, we've read your book, The Cold Dish. We'd love to have you come over and do a library event. Would you be willing to do that? And I wrote her back and I said, absolutely, happy to do it. And she wrote me back 3 minutes later and said, well, just so you know, we're just a little branch library out of Park County, in Cody, and we don't have a lot of money for honorarius or anything. And so I quickly looked up what an honoraria was, and then wrote her back. And I said, well, once you reach a certain level of literary notoriety, it's very difficult to negotiate your own honoraria. Mine's the same as it's always been, a 6-pack of Rainier beer, cans preferred. Problem was that got in all the newspapers in Wyoming. And subsequently, I have done all 63 of the libraries in Wyoming. And before you applaud my selflessness, you should be aware I haven't bought beer in about 17 years like that. So it's been kind of mutually beneficial for both parties, and the funny thing that happened was, I gained some more momentum, and things started happening, and then we had an opportunity, I had a little novella that I wrote called Spirit of Steamboat that got picked up for the first state read of Wyoming, which I'm very proud of. And they had me come down to the state library, down there in Cheyenne, and they had, the governor there and the attorney general and all the aficionados there. And the state librarian comes out with this 12-pack of Rainier beer. And let me tell you how much librarians like bringing beer into their libraries. She had it wrapped all up with brown paper and packing tape and twine and everything. It looked like heroin is what it looked like when she brought it out there. And so she brings it out and she hands it to me, sets it on the podium, and she goes, this was really kind of hard to get. And I was like, well, yeah, it's a working class, blue collar beer. A lot of the bars don't carry it anymore. And she goes, no, you don't understand. the distributors didn't have it. Like, and I said, well, yeah, if the bars don't carry it, then the distributors don't carry it. Like, and she goes, no, you don't understand. They're out of beer. This was about 2 weeks after the television show Longmire had started, and everybody saw Walt drinking Rainier beer, and they all went out and bought it. I don't know if they drank it, but they bought it, right? And so I'm listening to this story, and I'm thinking to myself, this sounds a little funny. I think I'm going to check this out. So I call up national headquarters for Rainier Beer, and I said, hey, are you guys? And the guy on the phone goes, we are out of beer. We have been brewing this stuff since Prohibition, and we've had a spike in sales unlike anything we've ever seen before, and we have no idea what's going on. And I was like, well, we have what we call in my business a clue. And so I tell him about Walt Longmire, the sheriff of Absaroka County, and I tell him about, the books and the TV show and all this. And we're having a wonderful conversation. It's going on about 5 or 10 minutes there. And then finally at the end of the conversation, he says, don't worry, because we're in full production. So it'll be back out on the shelves here in about 4 days. Which kind of gives you an indication of how long it takes to make Rainier beer, okay? I mean, if you're thinking that it's aging in fine oak casks, in ice caves in the Olympic peninsulas, you need to rethink that, all right? It's not quite that way. But yeah, that was a big deal. That was where my life kind of changed a little bit. I mean, we've been on the New York Times bestsellers list like that, but then, TV and movies kind of have a way of shooting you past a little bit further than that. And it was kind of a strange kind of a deal like that, because when they came and knocked on the door and they said, we want to make a TV show out of your book, like that. I was like, are you sure you want to do that? I mean, really? Try to talk them out of it, but they wouldn't go for it. And so they said, well, look, we'd like, to, have this show be, kind of cast conclusive like that, and so what that means is that, everybody has to agree when we find a Walt Longmire, an actor to play Walt Longmire, that everybody will agree that this will be the one that we all want. And I was like, well, I don't know if I'm going to be any help to you guys. And they said, well, you can be. Have you ever thought about actors that would play Walt Longmire? And I said, no, I've got friends and family and people I know. And I use those people as characters, in my books. One of my favorite quotes about writing is the one from Wallace Stegner on writing and teaching fiction, where he says the greatest piece of fiction ever written is the disclaimer at the beginning of every book that says nobody in this book is based off anybody alive or dead. And what a crock that is, but that's your job, is to go find interesting people and put them in your books. If you talk with me out there when I'm signing your book for more than 30 seconds, you're taking your literary life in your hands, okay? I just want to let you know that. And so, and it's the difficulty, of course, is that I live in a state that only has 500,000 people in it. All right. So if I stick somebody in my books, they all know who I'm talking about, for goodness sake. I mean, I'll write a book, and I'll be down in Rock Springs, right, in the southwest corner of Wyoming, and somebody will say, is that so-and-so in your 5th book? The guy from Gillette that's up there? And I can neither confirm nor deny that may be the person that you just mentioned. And, it's even worse up on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, because there's only 5,000 enrolled members of the Northern Cheyenne tribe. And so whenever I use anybody and, from the tribe on my books, they all know who it is I'm talking about. And I've been asked, have you ever gotten any, cultural appropriation pushback, from using, the Northern Cheyenne and their culture and their society in your books? Excuse me. And I'm like, well, only once. And they said, well, what was it? And I said, well, when I first started out, I thought that what you were supposed to do was, if you used real people in your books, you should change the name, to help protect the innocent, right? Or the guilty, either one. And so that's what I did. Well, now I'm at the point now where all my friends up on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation go, why did you change my name? I was going to buy 12 copies and give them to everybody and show them how famous I was, for goodness sake. So I kind of failed on that one like that. But anyway, I said, no, I don't know anybody. Hold on. That I use, I have real people that I use, and they said, well, if you were to think about any actors that you would use, for Walt Longmire, who would that be? So I thought about it, and I thought, well, Joe McCrae would have been a good Walt Longmire. Ben Johnson would have been a great Walt Longmire. Gary Cooper could have been a really good Walt Longmire. And it was at that point they told me that all those guys had been dead for 50 years and I was being no help at all. And so I said, I'm not going to be any help to you guys, because I just don't go see movies. I don't watch television, so I'm just not going to be any help to you guys. And so I thought I dodged a bullet. I thought I'd gotten out of this, right? And so the problem is like we're sitting there at the ranch one day, like at one evening actually, and the FedEx truck pulls up. And he gets out, like he never comes to our place at night, and so he pulls up and he says, "This is an overnight, Craig. Here, it's for you." And it said Warner Brothers, Horizon Television on it. And I thought, oh boy, here we go. I go inside to open the box, and the DVDs spill out onto the kitchen table, and it was all the actors that had auditioned for the role of Walt Longmire. And so, we were going to have to watch all of those, and it was a little bit of a problem like that because they could either go with somebody who was a big name actor, or they could go with somebody who was a lesser known actor. And so, they've got good points and bad points with both of those. And, with the big name, like you guys know as well as I do, like that if Hollywood has a piece like that where the character wears one of these, there are about 5 or 6 guys in Hollywood that get that role nowadays, pretty much over and over and over again. And they all do a wonderful job, but for my money, they've gone to the well one time too many, and you don't really see him as the character anymore. You see him as this conglomeration of cowboy roles, that they've played. And so I was kind of rooting for the unknown guy, right? Well, the difficulty with that is Walt is of a certain age, right? So, any actor that's going to play Walt is going to have to be of a certain age, right? And so, the problem with that being that if you're an actor and you're in Hollywood and you're 50 or 60 years old and you're still unknown, you might suck, okay, and Hollywood's really nervous about the whole suck thing, like that, and so I didn't know which direction they were going to go in this, like that, and so it was funny, like that, because, I'm standing there and I'm putting the DVDs in the DVD player and we're watching all these guys attempt to be Walt Longmire, like that, and they're all doing a fine job, like that, but none of them are really clicking for me, like that, and I get to the last one, I get to the very last DVD, and it says Robert Taylor. And I turned around and looked at Judy and I said, well, they took my advice after all, didn't they? Like, and so thank goodness somebody gets that joke. The under 30 joke in the crowd does not get the Robert Taylor joke at all. And so I put the DVD in, like, and I'm looking at, a couple of things I like about this guy. He's about 6'4". He's got like lines in his face. He's got mileage on him. He's got that gravelly voice. And I'm thinking, he's got good sheriff DNA. This would be our guy here. This might be one of the ones we go for. Like, and then in the audition, it's in the pilot episode, like, and what happens is Walt's doing a notification of death. And in law enforcement, it's the absolute worst job you can ever do, because basically what you're doing is going to someone's home and telling them that they are never going to get to see their loved one ever again. And he's doing that, and it was kind of interesting like that because he's never been to this woman's home before. He doesn't know her. And Robert Taylor was the only actor that did this. He took off his hat. And I was like, that's our guy. His mom taught him basic decency. We don't have to start from scratch. This is probably pretty good. It was about then that my wife sitting behind me went, oh my. I turn around and I look at her and she goes, he's handsome. Then she made it even worse. She goes, he's kind of like a TV version of you, taller, better looking, with a better voice. Like that. So I'm not as big of a fan of Robert Taylor as I used to be, I have to admit. But yeah, like it's been pretty wonderful. Like, and now the TV show has been out of production for like about 6 years, and we're still every week one of the top 10 to 20 shows on Netflix. Our little cowboy and Indian shows just keeps going along like that. But then of course for me, what it all comes down to is the books. Because that's basically what I am. I'm an author. And, as marvelous as Hollywood is, as marvelous as all of the movie stars and the sets and the wardrobe and locations and all these great things that they do, I'm always reminded of the fact that I've got one secret weapon that they don't have. Because what I do is I'm kind of like, I use words. I'm a wordsmith. And what my job is to line those words up like dominoes, just lining them up, going for the horizon. And then what I do is I just tip over that first word, and then your imagination does all my work for me. And that's just the most magnificent place in the world to work, I got to tell you. So for that, I thank you guys. Thank you so much. At this point, what I normally do is give you guys a reading. Would you guys like a little reading like that from the newest book? Like that? This is Hell and Back, like at the newest Walt Longmire book. And yeah, I think it was about 2 weeks ago. It landed at number 8 on the New York Times bestsellers list. Like that, and it's number 18 in the Walt Longmire series. Like, which sounds strange coming out of my mouth, I have to admit. But to tell you about this book, I kind of have to tell you a little bit about the book previous, Daughter of the Morning Star. In Daughter of the Morning Star, what had happened was I stumbled onto this situation like about 5 or 6 years ago. You got to remember, this is a while back. And I discovered, the situation with murdered and missing Indigenous women and got the statistics on it. And it was horrifying to see, how many. Like, we have over 710 Native people that have gone missing in the last year. And I thought, this is an issue that, people outside of Indian country really aren't aware of. Like, it really needs to be brought forward so that people are more, knowledgeable of it. And so I knew that was a story that I wanted to write. Like, but then the question becomes, what's the story? What was the story? You have a cause, but what's the story? And so about that time, like, I had a good friend of mine, Tiger Scalpcane, who's the athletic director for the high school up in Lame Deer on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. Looked at it, and he said, "Hey, my daughter's one of the, going to be a starting center this Friday. You got to come up and see a ball game." And so we did. Like that, we jumped, in the truck, drove up to see the ball game. Like that, we get there, like that. And this was, for those of you in the know, this was Lodge Grass versus Lame Deer. And some of you know what that means. That means Crow versus Northern Cheyenne. And for those of you who think that the Indian Wars are over, they are not. They're being played out on the basketball courts is where they're being played out. And this was a particularly vicious game. I got to tell you, I have never seen so many hip checks, elbows, bloody noses, dislocated fingers. And this was the girls' basketball team, okay? And it was actually brutal to watch. But it was fantastic in some ways too, because those young women were just so ferocious. They were so absolutely dedicated in what it was that they were doing for tribal pride, for personal pride, and just their faces glowed as they were playing this game. And as we walked out of there, I turned to Judy and I was like, "That's what this story is. That's what the story is." And so what happens is there's a young woman by the name of Jaya Long, who starts receiving death threats. She's a phenomenal player, and she starts receiving these death threats. And Lolo Long, the tribal police chief, gets in touch with Walt and says, "Hey, I need somebody to come up here, and do a little bit of investigation like that. Maybe do a little bit of bodyguard work here too, if you're available." And so, of course, Walt enlists Henry as his go-to guy and they go up and they do this job. And this is a situation that has to be taken very, very seriously, simply because Jaya actually had a sister, Jeannie, who went missing a year before, and nobody knows what happened to her, or where she went, or anything. But during the course of this investigation, Walt keeps stumbling into the name of this town, Fort Pratt, Montana. Supposedly there was a boarding school there somewhere at one point in time, and there was a big tragedy where the boarding school burned down. And, Walt keeps hearing about it. And he keeps asking everybody he runs into, and he says, "Well, do you know where Fort Pratt is?" And their answer is, "Oh, yeah, it's up near, it's over by, nobody knows where it is." Everybody knows it exists. Nobody knows exactly where it is. And so by the time we get to the end of Daughter of the Morning Star, it kind of shoots Walt off in this trajectory to go and try and find what more of the answers could possibly be from Daughter of the Morning Star. And that is what happens in Hell and Back. And now I'll give you a reading if you'd like. I'm not going to read the whole book because I think you can do that at home. So here we go. The quote that I used for this book is actually from T.S. Eliot. Hell is oneself. Hell is alone. The other figures in it merely projections. There is nothing to escape from and nothing to escape to. One is always alone. Chapter 1. There was a sound of bells, and then the silence. The kind of quiet that only comes with snow, capturing the sound waves of life and smothering them before they can cry out. I couldn't open my eyes, like something was weighing them down, so I brought my hand up to my face and brushed the snow away. My eyes worked now, so I tried to sit up, feeling something strike my chest, something small and metallic. Two somethings. Snow. A lot of it. Falling in static sheets, fat flakes covering everything, silencing everything as they cascaded down from the yellowish black skies. I I was lying in the middle of the street. I started to stand, but discovered that part of my sheepskin coat was frozen to the ground. Leaning over to one side, I noticed that there were $2 silver in my lap. So I pulled a glove off with my teeth and picked up one of the coins that were old ones, but looked remarkably unsullied. I glanced around again, couldn't see anybody else on the street, so I figured finders keepers. Scooping up the other one, I deposited them both into my pocket and then pulled the glove back on, tugging the tiny red beaded ends on the loose strap to snug it. I reached behind me and pulled my coat loose from the ice. I had at least been lying out here long enough for it to freeze to the ground. Raising myself to a kneeling position, I felt something around my neck and pulled the material up to find a red scarf. It hadn't particularly looked like a man's scarf, silky with fringed end. With the current weather conditions, I figured I didn't have many choices. Momentarily distracted, I saw a lump of snow beside me and reached over to find it was a pinch front cowboy hat. I slapped it against my knee to knock it clean. Figuring it was also mine, I lifted it and tugged it on over my head. It felt a little tight, but that was probably from being frozen as it was. I stood the rest of the way up and shook off the accumulated snow from my coat like a dog. I was at the top of a hill, which looked down a winding 2-lane road that dropped off into a small town about a mile away. Turning, I could see the top of the hill was covered with tiny crosses encircled by a wrought iron fence, where a little further off the corner of a stone building still stood, shedding rubble into the snow, a large lump of which was centered in some sort of platform. Above the gate, I saw the arch with the words, Fort Pratt Industrial Indian Boarding School. There was some movement at the apogee of this arch, and I watched as a great horned owl slowly swiveled his head from back to front to look at me, golden eyes shining like twin harvest moons. Howdy. He continued to observe me with all the patience in the world. Well, at least you didn't say who. Sighing, I turned back towards town, thinking I might get a little more conversation in that direction. Starting down the 2-lane, I lumbered through the snow for a while, eventually passing a few of the buildings on the outskirts, a house or two, a library, and then what looked to be an old Catholic church. There were buildings on either side of the road, the type of single-story storefronts seen in many small towns scattered across the Rocky Mountain West. Plastic wreaths hung from the dozen or so lampposts with red electric candles in each that flickered yellow and then as I passed dimmed, one at a time. I couldn't really tell if it was night or day, with the skies colored a strange yellowish cast and the inclement weather. The surrounding distance was darkened to an ocean of obscurity. There were a few lit buildings, a 2-story grand structure to my left, the Baker Hotel, and a movie theater on the corner with a yellow and green neon marquee that read, Support Your Local Sheriff. I had a mild headache and could smell something burning, as if there were a forest fire not too far away. And I felt strangely detached for a guy who'd been left lying in the street. With a deep sigh, I took a few more steps and trudged up to the side of the road, amazed that I had been scraped up by a snowplow. My back hurt, and my limbs and head felt heavy. I must have been lying out there for quite some time. There were no cars or trucks parked on the street as far as I could see. I stepped onto the curb and the sidewalk, and there was a cafe at the other end of the block, and I decided to walk in that direction, even though it appeared that was the way out of town. Booths lined the glass front of the place, and the condensation on the inside of the windows promised warmth. A woman with strawberry blonde hair was wiping the counter, but no patrons, and I was worried that the little restaurant might be closed. I was relieved when I pushed open the wooden bar and the glass door swung open, a bell jingling just above my head. Appearing to be in her mid-30s, she was stunningly beautiful. Dressed in a waitress uniform, she looked up at me, and there was something about her that stuck the words in my throat. I swallowed. I'm sorry, are you open? She looked at the clock on the wall and advertised the Red Lodge Soda Company. It was 8:17 p.m. Not closing for another 43 minutes, but I was thinking of closing with the blizzard and all. She looked back up at me. Can I help you? I slipped off my hat and stared through the fogged windows back onto the street. Is it a blizzard? She laughed, a silvery melodic sound that made me turn back to her and smile. Storm of the century, what, you don't read the papers? Not recently. I walked over and sat on the stool in front of her and placed my hat on the one next to me. You know what? I think I need a cup of coffee. You got it. She smiled, her hazel eyes sparkling. The co-op says they're not going to get the power back on for 31 hours. I watched as she plucked a buffalo china mug from the counter and then walked to the coffee maker and pulled the pot out by its plastic handle. I glanced around the well-lit space. How is it that you still have electricity? Municipal generator system on the hill outside of town near the old boarding school. I guess back in the day the power went out all the time. She rested the mug on the counter. Are you new around here? Yeah. I looked at the street. At least I think so. She laughed at the absurdity of my response. You're not sure? I pulled the red scarf from my neck, stuffing it into my hat, and unbuttoned my heavy coat. Well, to be honest, I just woke up out there on the road a minute ago. She stared at me. Are you drunk? I don't think so. Drunk is more fun than this. I pulled off my gloves and tucked them into my pocket and sipped my coffee as she studied me. You look familiar. I nodded and smiled. You know, it's funny, but when I came in here, I was thinking the same thing about you. The coffee tasted hot, rich, and life reaffirming. What's your name? Martha. I sat there looking at her and thinking that of all the names in the world that I could have chosen for her, that one was perfect. Just Martha? She nodded, stepping back guardedly. Just Martha, for now. She glanced at my hand. It's a great name. I started to stick it out further to shake hers, but then stopped. I lowered it and then went back to studying. As I lowered it, she went back to studying my face. Is there something wrong? I don't want to panic you or anything, but I can't seem to remember my own name. Her eyes narrowed as she folded her arms. Your name's Walt Longmire. So we do know each other? No. Then how is it that you know my name? It's on the liner of your hat. I reached over and picked the thing up, removing the scarf and reading the barely legible gold lettering in the sweatband. This hat belongs to Walt Longmire, a gift from the grateful people of Absaroka County, Wyoming. I looked up at her. Is this Absaroka County? She moved closer, staring at me, pressing the palms of her hands against the edge of the counter. Not even Wyoming. Welcome to Fort Pratt, Montana, Walt Longmire. Well, there are a number of worrisome things about that little sequence right there. And some of them are pretty evident. Like at the first one, that Walt wakes up, in the middle of the street and doesn't know who he is. But he's been laying there for so long, his coat is frozen to the ground. And those of you who are familiar with the storylines and have read the books know that Walt has not worn that sheepskin coat since the first book, The Cold Dish, 17 years ago, when they had to cut it off of him. Another thing to take into consideration is, what's the first thing that Walt meets in Fort Pratt, Montana? An owl. And for the Northern Cheyenne, the owls are called the messengers that travel between the camp of the living and the camp of the dead. Walt also wakes up with 2 silver dollars over his eyes. And for those of us who are knowledgeable in mythology, probably from our reading, we know that you don't make it across the river Styx without giving the ferryman his ferry due, which is 2 silver dollars. And the other thing that they used to do also in the Old West was, back before they had such technology, like that, whenever they would have a dead body who the eyes kept, eyelids kept flipping open, they would close the eyelids and then put a coin on top of them to hold them still until rigor set in. Walt gets down into town. All through this night, as he's traveling through, it's consistently 8:17 p.m. And every number that he runs into, whether it's the name, the number of a hotel room or an address or anything at all, it's always 31 in this town. He can't figure out why that is. And then finally, who is it? The first person that he meets in the town of Fort Pratt, Montana? Martha. Strangely enough, Walt's wife's name was Martha. And she seems to bear a striking resemblance to the memory of her. But we know she died more than 5 years ago. And everybody that Walt meets in this town, he has the strangest feeling that he's met them somewhere before, but that they're dead. And what does that mean for him? And somewhere out in that darkness is something that's created this world for him. and something he has no control over. And I'll tell you how I came to know the Evo Etse Heo Mese. I was sitting on the front porch of my good friend Charles Whiteman, who was a tribal elder with the Northern Cheyenne. And his grandkids were out playing past the corral. And it was getting dark, like you could see him and then you couldn't see him. And finally he yelled out to him to tell him to come back. And they weren't paying any attention to him until he used the phrase, Evo Etse Heo Mese. And then those kids came scooting back over to the house. And so I asked Charles, I said, Charles, I've never heard that term. What is it? And he goes, oh, it's just a boogeyman. It's just this boogeyman that we use like that to scare the kids to make sure they come back, like get, back where the people are and everything. And I was like, oh, okay, all right. And so I got home and I dig out my Grinnell Bird, dictionary of Cheyenne, like that, and flip the thing open, of which about half the words are wrong. And so I dig it out, like that, and I'm looking it up, and I look up those two words, Evo Etse Heo Mese, the wandering without. And I thought, that's kind of bone-chilling to think about now, isn't it? And so the next time I saw Charles was like a couple, weeks later. I ran into him, and I said, "Hey, Charles, I've been thinking about that phrase that you use, Evo Etse Heo Mese, and I was just wondering, have you ever thought about where that might have come from?" And he said, I have, and I've been thinking about that because I knew the next time I saw you, you were going to ask me that question. And he said, you know what? It's an old phrase. It's an old phrase that's been used for years and years, because he said, I remember my great-grandparents using that phrase. He says, and my great-grandfather fought at the Little Bighorn. He says, so it's something that's been around for an awfully long time. And I said, well, where do you think the idea came from? He says, well, what you got to remember, he said, is in my society, you got to remember that we didn't have, back in the day, we didn't have prisons and we didn't have police officers or anything like that. So if anybody did something that was so bad that they had to be taken away from the company of the human beings, he said, what we did was we would banish them. And he said, we would banish them into the wilderness. He says, that period in time, if you were a human being alone, you didn't last very long. It was a death sentence is what it was. And he said, I couldn't help but think of all those individuals, whatever it is that their problems might have been, that had died out there in the wilderness, that they seek each other out and combine together to make the Evo Etse Heo Mese, the walking without. Is it possible that they could have been that? And he said, wouldn't they have a hunger for human companionship? Wouldn't that be something that they would seek out and try and draw in for themselves? And I thought, that sounds like something that Walt Longmire could go up against. That's all you get tonight. That's all I'm going to tell you. So you have to read the book and find out what happens. Like that said. Normally what I do at this point in time is open it up and let you guys ask some questions. I'm hoping that some of you will have some questions. I know some of you have asked me some questions before, and I told you to wait until the Q&A session. Like that. And so now's your chance. Those of you who are my plants, like that, and all of you who might have some other questions. Yes, sir.
Did some of the current state of our world write the stories themselves? I can just imagine Paul Longmire in some of our political affairs right now.
Yeah, you can't help but think that, what's going on in the world has an effect, on you, especially if you're an artist. I use that term loosely when I'm talking about writers, certainly about me. But I think that in many ways, sometimes Hell and Back was a little bit of a product of that isolation, that of COVID and what was going on and everything. And, I thought to myself, Walt really can't trust himself in this situation. And it was a different kind of book in the sense that, usually the books are all written in first person, and so everybody gets to be on the same footing with Walt as this investigation is going on. You get the chance to figure out who did it as quickly as Walt does. But in this particular book, for the first time in 17 years, you have the advantage over Walt because you know who he is and you know what's going on a lot more than he does. And so, yeah, I think definitely, I think, whether it's political, whether it's social, cultural, whatever, those things tend to thread their needles, into whatever it is that you happen to be working on. And that certainly was the case with this particular book, I have to say honestly. So, yes, sir.
Will you keep writing, hopefully?
Absolutely, there'll be another Walt Longmire. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal. When I get ready to stop, ask me about the next Walt Longmire. Because what will happen is I will walk out of here and not tell you what the next Walt Longmire book is about. And then as we're driving back across South Dakota, Judy will turn to me and go, why didn't you tell them about the next book? So, will somebody please remind me when we get to the end, and I will tell you about the next Walt Longmire book. How's that? Deal? Yes, sir.
So there's a current series on television that's highly rated and highly regarded, but as you move into it, by first episode, the language is just a little too much to handle. And I realize that's subjective, but you chose to stay away from that in your book, and I'd be curious what you were thinking.
Well, I mean, there's some language in the books, especially one particular character. Vic talks like someone who would be a cop in Philadelphia, like that. So she's got a couple of favorite words she uses that kind of add a certain spice, to things like that. And that's kind of one of the joys, of writing the books is that each novel is kind of like conducting a choral group, and I'm always telling students, that don't worry about what your characters look like because you're only going to get to describe them one time, but they're going to talk all the way through that book. And so concentrate on how their voices are going to be different. And Vic, being from Philadelphia, is going to talk in a very, very different manner in which Walt, who is from Wyoming, is going to look at. And so that's kind of a joy for me like that. But I don't know, as far as that kind of thing is concerned, I think a little goes an awfully long way. I mean, as far as sex and violence is concerned, excuse me, just a touch, is enough. One of my favorite examples that I use, in a novel is, a moment of violence, is from To Kill a Mockingbird. The part where Atticus, when the rabid dog is coming down the street and they call, Heck Tate, the sheriff, and Atticus, to come, and they show up, and Heck Tate, the sheriff, tosses the rifle to Atticus, the lawyer. And his two kids about have a heart attack because they'd never seen him hold a gun in his life. And, he turns and looks at him and says, don't you know your daddy's the best shot in 2 counties? And, when he gets ready to shoot the rabid dog from down the street, and what Harper Lee did with it was absolutely magnificent because he pulls the rifle up and pushes his glasses up on his head, aims, and the glasses fall. And he pushes the glasses back up again. And that rabid dog is getting closer. It's coming down that street. And he aims up, the glasses fall again. This time he just brushes them from his face. And when Scout's doing, it's because it's from her viewpoint, when she tells you about it, does she tell you about the rifle going off? No. Does she tell you about the dog getting hit by a bullet? No. What does she tell you? She tells you about when the glasses fall to the pavement, that little tink when the glass breaks. What more do you need to say? I think that's the poetry of writing. And it's a lot easier, I think, maybe to do. Maybe not. Like, I'm not a television producer, so I can't say. But that's what you're looking for. You're looking for that kind of poetry, to get that kind of information across. And I think that, the more salacious qualities, they tend to be in television and movies like that because they like to, show you everything. And I like to leave a lot for the imagination, because I love your guys' imaginations. Like, it really is the most wonderful place to, you think that I spend my time, sitting at that writing desk, writing for 8 hours. I'm out there in your imagination, prowling around, finding all that stuff and seeing how this is going to work or whether this is going to work and all of that. And to me, that's the joy of it. So that's why I'll always have a certain amount of restraint whenever I'm dealing with those issues. But thank you for noticing. I appreciate that a great deal. By the way, in case you don't know, this is the way it works. When you ask me a question, it takes me 10 minutes to answer. And so we have time for one more question. I'm lying. I'll stay here as long as you would like. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your exquisite language and character.
Oh, thank you. Have you guys met my sister? Have you?
My name is John.
Well, see?
Anyway, I'm curious about you serving Vietnam.
No, ma'am, no.
No, you did not.
No.
So I'm curious about the character of Henry standing there and the relationship with Walt. And did you have or do you have a relationship with someone like Henry standing there on this?
I do. Yeah, if you came to where I live, if you came to Buffalo, Wyoming, especially on like Longmire days, when they're all there, If you met like all of the people that I base all my characters off of, you would go, he's really not that good of a writer. He just knows a lot of interesting people, like that, you know? And I laugh about that too, because people sometimes ask me, they said, do you worry about running out of ideas? And I'm like, no, I live in rural Wyoming. I'm never going to run out of ideas, you know, for goodness sake, like that. But yeah, just about every single native character in my books is based off of somebody I know up on the res. And the good friend of mine, like who's the basis for Henry, is a fellow by the name of Marcus Red Thunder, and he's just a truly remarkable individual. Like that, I mean, he has this incredible spiritual side, but he also has this incredible sense of humor. And I always laugh about that because I'm always seeing all these movies and TV shows where they have native characters, but the characters are so somber. I mean, they're always these straight-laced, kind of characters. That's not the natives I know. The natives I know work on 17 different layers of irony, and if you're not aware of that irony, you get to be the butt of that irony. And so I'm very aware of that, in many ways, like that. But yeah, it's too easy. It's just too easy, to take, aspects, of them, and put them, in my books, and they're just marvelous individuals, incredible people, so I'd be a fool, to not include them in my books. Also, it wouldn't be an accurate representation of the place where I live if I didn't include them. Whenever somebody writes, something about my part of the world and there are no natives in it, I'm like, where did they go? What did you do with them anyway? And so it's kind of important that they be there. And Marcus bears a lot of resemblances to Henry, the one being that, there was one time we were, if you notice, Henry doesn't use any contractions. Whenever he speaks, he doesn't use any contractions. In actuality, I had a guy write me here 2 days ago. This happens periodically, and somebody will write me and they'll say, I found a contraction. Henry uses a contraction on page 267 in the new book, and I have to break the news to them that I've put one contraction in every book for the last 17 years. And that means they have to go back and look for all 17 of them, for goodness sake. It's a cheap trick to get somebody to go back and reread your entire canon of books. Actually, what it was, though, it was because of the Navajo, whenever they weave a rug, they always weave a mistake, into the rug so as to not tempt the gods, with perfection. Well, my books ain't anywhere near perfection, so I have to worry about that. But I just thought it would be fun, to do that every time. And he, every once in a while, I'll be at a public event with him, and he'll be speaking, and I'll notice he'll drop into this B-movie Indian speak where he doesn't use any contractions. And finally, after one of those, I looked at him and I said, "Why do you do that? What are you doing that for?" And he goes, "Just to piss white people off," like that, And I was okay. I thought, check, gonna use that one. Yes, ma'am. Right. Well, in the books, his name is Virgil. They switched him over in the TV show like that, but his name is Hector in the TV show, but it's Virgil in the books. And how Virgil came into being was I was writing a book called Hell is Empty. And it took place up in the mountains, at the Bighorns, and these convicts escape and Walt has to go after them. And when I was thinking about the book, one of the things I looked at, I thought to it myself, I thought, this is rapidly going to turn into one of those manhunt in the snow books, and that book's been written numerous times over. So it needs another element, is what it needs. And so, in the book, Cesar Batoria, the Basque deputy, is actually reading Dante's Inferno, is what he's reading. And so, whenever Walt gets ready to go out into the wilderness to go after these guys, Sancho looks at him and says, "Boss, I know how much you hate to be stuck anywhere without a good book. Here, take this one with you," and shoves it down in his backpack. And from that point on, what the book does is it mimics Dante's Inferno. So that Walt's trip through the Bighorn Wilderness area and Cloud Peak Wilderness area and the Bighorn National Forest mimics Dante's tour through hell. And of course, one of the biggest characters that's in Dante's Inferno is the Roman poet Virgil. And so I thought, I need a Virgil. But I thought having a Roman poet show up in the Bighorn Mountains was kind of a stretch. And so I thought maybe a crow shaman, a 7'2" crow shaman, whose name is Virgil. Maybe that would be someone that I could use. So I introduced that character actually all the way back in the 4th book, Another Man's Moccasins. And, and that's how he came to be. And it's still a question. He's kind of like a little bit of a spiritual, charting course, for Walt, kind of a North Star, to keep him in line, and he does once again appear in Hell and Back, like which I was glad to see him again. An awful lot of characters reappear in Hell and Back because, they're seeing Walt again. So, anybody else? I'm sorry, somebody else had their hand up. Yes, sir, all the way in the back there.
You were a supporter of William Kent Kruger.
Yes.
And so I started reading his books based on your recommendation. I can't help but notice the similarities between local lawman who is deeply ensconced in the traditions of the native culture. Will we ever see a Longmire?
I doubt it. As much as I love Kent, I don't work and play well with others. It was like what happened was when they started doing the TV show, they offered me a position in the writer's room. They said, well, do you want to come and be in the writer's room in Los Angeles? And the first thing it was like, first I'd have to go live in Los Angeles, and I don't want to do that. And then the second one was, who wants me there? My gosh, all these TV writers, and you want the guy that's been writing these books for 10 years that lives where this all happens. Like, who wants that 600-pound gorilla in the room arguing with them about everything? And so I thought, nah, I don't think so. I like the freedom of doing what I do, how I do it. And I think I would have problems, working with, somebody else, even someone as nice as Ken. I mean, he's like one of the nicest guys you could ever possibly meet. But, we write in two different worlds. And, if you're going to partner up with somebody, that means your characters are living in the same world. And so whatever's in his books, I have to keep track of and put it in my books. Whatever's in my books, he would have to keep track and put it in his books. And knowing the two of us well enough, I know that we'd never be able to do it, to be honest with you, too. So the other thing is that we're with separate publishers, and they would never allow for it. So it doesn't really matter. They wouldn't know where to tear that dollar in half, to get that done. So somebody else had their hand up, I remember seeing. Yes, ma'am.
You talked a little bit about how you chose the character of Longmire.
Uh-huh.
Did you have input into the narrator of the audiobook?
I did, as a matter of fact. Good old George Guidell. I will have you know. And that's kind of a funny story. I actually got George. How I got George, is I had a short story that won the Tony Hillerman Cowboys and Indian Mystery Short Story Award. I think the title was longer than a lot of the entries. I think it was. And so anyway, but the great thing was, you got to go have dinner with Tony Hillerman. And the funny thing was, we're sitting there at the kitchen table one morning, and Judy takes this copy of Cowboys and Indians magazine, with the announcement, for the entries, and slides it under my coffee cup and says, "You should do that." Well, only those of us who've been married for a couple of years know how easily you can, just ignore the words "you should do that," And so I was like, I don't write short stories and so I'm not going to do it. And so then I went down to the barn, and I'm shoveling out the barn. And those of you who've done that kind of work know how much free time in your mind you have. And so, I'm thinking, about it. And I thought, well, if you were to write a short story, what would you write about? And so I got back up to the house, and I sat down and I wrote this short story. It was called Old Indian Trick. And I got it finished and I came down for lunch, and I casually tossed it onto the kitchen table and said, "There's your short story." And that's when my loving and supportive wife read the short story and said, "Well, you're not going to win with that." And she was right. She was right. It was rough. It was a first time attempt at a short story. And so I went back over the months, would rewrite it. It won. It actually won. And so I got to go have dinner with Tony Hillerman. And so I'm having dinner with Tony Hillerman, and he knows I'm doing, this back and forth with audiobooks, recorded books about getting the books recorded. And he looks at me and he goes, "See if you can get George Guidell to do your books. He does all of mine. And he's a really great performer, and he'd be a good reader for you." And so I thought, okay, and so the next day I'm talking to him at Recorded Books, and they said, "Well, we've got a couple of different readers that we're looking at. One of them is George Guidell." And I said, "Him." And they said, "You don't want to hear the others?" And I was like, "No, if he's good enough for Tony Hillerman, he's good enough for me." And so I was feeling pretty good about that. And then what happened is that I actually was in New York at the time when Tony was, recording one of my books. And so we did a nice interview. We had a nice conversation. They stopped the recorders, and I look over at him and I go, "You have the most amazing voice. I mean, the width and the breadth of what it is that you're able to do with your voice. You must have an incredible singing voice." And he goes, "Oh no. You'll never want to hear me sing. That's the worst thing that you could ever possibly have happen." And I was like, "Oh, really?" In the next book, it was Dark Horse, and that's the one where Walt's out on the Powder River, in the cheap motel, and the guys next door are playing the AM radio, and they're playing it really loud, and it's Eddie Arnold's Cattle Call. You know, the George calls me up on the phone and goes, "You son of a bitch." Okay, I was like, "Hi, George, how are you?" Like, you know, and he goes, "You'll have Walt sing for 4 books. I suddenly tell you I don't sing, and now you have Walt sing. Not only do you have Walt sing, you have him yodel? Really?" So I'm not sure if George has actually forgiven me for it just yet. Like I said, we'll see what happens. Guys, thank you so much for being here this evening. I appreciate it. Oh, you want to squeeze one more in here real quick? Sure. Tell you about the next book. That's right, see? I told you. Thank you. You're my new lawyer. I just want to tell you. And I would have, I just walked right off here and just driven back. Judy right around Chamberlain. Judy would have gone, "Did you tell him about the new book?" So actually what happens in the new book, it's actually called Proud Flesh is the title. And for those of you who are equestrian oriented, you know what proud flesh is. What happens is a horse, when it wounds itself like that, on its leg, on its lower features there, what happens is there's a tissue, a granulated tissue that comes in to fill in that pocket, basically get it so that they can get up on their feet and be able to get away from predators in a faster way. The problem is that it does not contain some of the more complex aspects of the physiology, like nerve endings and things like that. And so what happens is like the granulated flesh comes in, but then if you want it to grow back correctly, you have to carve that granulated flesh back out and allow for a longer period of time for the nerve endings and everything to come back in. And I'd heard from this older sheriff that I was talking to, he mentioned proud flesh in this one investigation that he was working on. And I said, "What? I know that term, in equestrian sense like that, but what is it in an investigation?" He said, "Well, that's when you got an investigation and you think you know the answers and you pack your investigation with all the wrong answers." He says, "And then that's all the time that you spend getting those wrong answers back out of that investigation so you can find the right ones." And I was like, "Oh, that's a Walt Longmire book is what that is." And so what happens, of course, is Walt's actually on a search and rescue up in the Bighorn Mountains. There's a woman's planted her car up there and gotten off the road. And so they're looking for her, trying to find her like that. And they think she's in one area. Walt thinks she's in another because, as Walt says, nobody gets lost going uphill. And so he finds her like that. And then his radio doesn't work. His two-way radio doesn't work. And so he has to use her cell phone to go up on a rocky ledge there like that and call out, let 911, let them know that he's found her and that everything's okay. They're going to be coming out on this certain trailhead and all of this like that. And so he's standing there looking around and he remembers a story. It was a story that his father told him when he was young. And he said, "Have I ever told you about the first man that I ever saw killed?" And Walt says, No. And he tells him this story about this individual, Bill Sutherland, the accountant for the state of Wyoming, and how he'd come back from World War II, wanted to go on an elk hunt at Walt's father and grandfather's elk camp. And they brought him in, and he's killed. He's accidentally killed. At least they think it's an accident. They aren't sure because they can't find the weapon. It's a 300 H&H Magnum. It's a relatively new weapon in 1948. And nobody in the hunting camp was carrying that particular weapon. And as Walt's standing there looking around, dog is digging around under the rocks. And so he tells the dog, "Get away from there," before a badger or marmot comes out and takes his nose off. The dog keeps digging. Dog raises its head up and it's got a piece of leather strap in its mouth. Could be a piece of horse tack. Could be a rifle sling. That's what it turns out to be. Walt reaches down in there and pulls out this circa 1948 300 H&H Magnum, the exact weapon that killed Bill Sutherland. And I like to think of Walt as being one of the most ecumenical, open-minded detectives in the face of the earth. I mean, he's truly a believer in innocent until proven guilty, until he finds out this weapon actually belonged to Lloyd Longmire, his grandfather. That's all you get tonight. I'll see you outside. Thank you guys so much. I'll shoot down